My name is Michael Scott. I'm a historian and an avid student of the Roman Empire. One of its greatest legacies is now one of the world's great religions, Christianity. For Christians, the essential event in the foundation of their faith is the crucifixion. But for the Romans, it's a complete non-event. It doesn't even rate a footnote in their histories.
Yet out of this clash of perspectives comes the very same result. The Roman Empire becomes Christian.
What has always fascinated me is why this epic story has the same outcome, but two often contradictory accounts. So now, I want to know what really happened. How does he become this?
Just over 1,700 years ago, after a century dominated by crisis, the Romans finally have a strong ruler in charge.
Pagan Emperor Diocletian participates in a sacrifice to the gods. His soothsayers probe the entrails for a sign of their support for the empire. But there is no message. The soothsayers blame the presence of non-pagans, Christians. After such bad omens, Diocletian issues an astonishing series of decrees. Christianity must be wiped out. For the Jesus movement and its disciples, their very survival now hangs in the balance. At the end of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire is recovering from a series of catastrophic wars compounded by political and economic meltdown. Emperor Diocletian and the majority of his Roman subjects still believe their prospects are in the lap of the pagan gods. In Roman times, blood sacrifice is the traditional way to win the gods' favor. With Rome weakened, Diocletian needs their goodwill.
Bear in mind, in Roman society, most religions and cults are tolerated. So if you choose to hide in a cave, celebrate a god being born from a rock, killing a bull, and having a banquet, or if you choose to be taken to the very edges of death as an initiate of the cult of Isis, most of the time, that's pretty much fine. But what the Romans are unequivocal about is that you must be willing to make a sacrifice for the good of the empire and the emperor every time you're asked to.
Diocletian, as Bible-era historian Professor Kate Cooper of Manchester University argues, has even more at stake.
If you want to stay emperor, you've got to keep the gods happy. You've got to have the gods think that you are the one who will maintain their cult on earth and will maintain the empire in good order.
For Christians, sacrificing to the pagan gods is like a red rag to a bull. Jesus' crucifixion was the ultimate sacrifice. Now, they've already fallen foul of the Roman authorities in the past for refusing. And although at the very least Christian chroniclers had been stretching the truth of their harsh treatment at the hands of the state, this time it seems to be different. Reality may at last be catching up with the propaganda.
Christians are directly challenging the emperor. The fact of refusing to sacrifice, it's somewhere in between a religious failure and treason. Diocletian is very careful to deal sharply and swiftly with religious deviants.
Once again, Christians are refusing to obey the system, which singles them out to target them. They are now the enemy within.
Diocletian launches a regime of state-sponsored persecution. It's said to be the most aggressive and far-reaching attempt to eradicate Christianity in all history, known to Christians simply as the Great Persecution.
If true, this is nothing less than a defining moment in Roman history. According to reports written by Christian Bishop Eusebius of Caesarea, the persecution is more brutal than ever before.
Eusebius, he describes some terrible events. Churches destroyed, scriptures burned, services banned. Christians losing all their ranks, forced to work in the mines. They are blinded by irons, killed by axes, and roasted on spits.
Eusebius also records how in 308 AD, merchants in the east of the empire sprinkle their goods with blood from pagan offerings, exposing Christians who won't buy them. And that apparently tax exemptions are even promised to the cities most willing to persecute Christians. I can't help wondering that if the witch hunt is this extreme, then Christianity could not possibly survive. And I've been told some Christians do escape by running for the hills.
Although the sun is up, it's a freezing winter's morning here at Masaba out in the Judean desert. This is one of the oldest inhabited monasteries in the world. It's founded about 180 years after the Great Persecution, but we know that refuges in places like this are created in the early 4th century for Christian believers as well. This time sees the emergence of the Christian concept of monasticism as a recognizable category. Papyri from Egypt, for example, begin to talk about the monarchos, the monk. People like St. Anthony, who in the late 3rd century takes himself off into the desert in Egypt to live a pious and solitary life.
He's one of the most famous of the early desert fathers, renowned for being a founder of monasticism.
Now, though there's no evidence that Antony's decision is prompted by Roman persecution, it's thought that his example inspires other persecuted Christians to seek safety and solace in remote monastic life during and after the Great Persecution. Of course, the details of how monks live their lives on a day-to-day basis has changed dramatically over the centuries, but the essential principle, I think, has remained the same, that need and desire for separation from not just society, but events going on in the world at large.
In order to give space and time for reflection. I've only had the chance to spend a short time here at the monastery in Masaba, but already I'm beginning to feel that wonderful calm and tranquility that comes from separation. Not a likely place for your enemies to attack. So as Christian historian Eusebius is keen to remind us, some intrepid Christians reach these monastic outposts and avoid the Great Persecution. Meanwhile, there is one decisive, more Roman reason why Diocletian's reprisals falter.
Few rulers have successfully maintained control of the entire empire for any length of time in almost 100 years.
Diocletian's brainwave is to split the empire into 4 parts, or districts, each under the command of a different co-ruler. He called it the Tetrarchy.
Why does this matter for our story? Well, it matters because the different rulers of the different parts of the Tetrarchy have varying attitudes to Christian persecution. So persecution varies depending on where you are in the empire. And this is compounded by regional events. So A famine in the east, for example, in 311, leads Romans to persecute Christians more because they think their pagan gods are upset, and this is the way to get them back on side.
Many Christians are killed. We'll never be certain of the actual numbers, especially as Bishop Eusebius is often thought guilty of elaborating in his accounts. In fact, some historians think it plausible not all deaths are at the hands of the Roman authorities.
We don't have any way of being sure what were really religiously motivated, rather than simply being the kind of mob violence that happens at a moment of profound political instability.
What I do know is that not all Romans are bloodthirsty murderers, and not many have ever been interested in killing Christians just for being Christian. As I've already learned, 100 years earlier, for example, the martyr Perpetua has to help her executioner deliver the fatal cut because he couldn't bring himself to do it on his own.
In fact, many argue that the Great Persecution is not as far-reaching or as popular with the Romans as many early church historians make out.
Eusebius is able, in a sense, to take a few instances and really make you think that that's what's happening everywhere. And the truth is, we just don't know what was happening beyond the areas that he himself talks about. Eusebius completely colors our whole understanding of this period. And there are times at which we really have to ask ourselves whether there's a distorting lens.
As I've discovered from earlier persecutions, it's also a golden opportunity for Christianity to turn adversity to its own advantage. In the first 2 centuries of their existence, Jesus has been transformed from common criminal to compassionate Messiah. The Christian movement has endured accusations of sexual debauchery, not to mention burning down Rome. And they've rewritten a handful of executed believers into a roll call of heroic martyrs. To all that, they can now add surviving the Great Persecution.
Diocletian's plan to completely eradicate Christianity fails, but that doesn't mean his attempts don't have a profound impact on the early Christians.
Because aside from their chroniclers seizing the chance to glorify genuine members for another triumph over oppression, more importantly, it galvanizes the movement. It becomes a logistical victory for Christianity itself.
There were lots of different enclaves, and if one was badly hit, the others might well have survived unscathed. Communities can often grow back stronger if they've been through a trauma that they've survived with dignity.
The infrastructure gradually put in place over the past 2 centuries, the places of worship, bishops, priests, and sacred texts, all emerge in a new guise. Out of the torment is born a revitalized organization, what we now call the Church. And in 311, just as the Great Persecution draws to a close, the Christians and their leadership, the Church, has, outwardly at least, never looked so strong.
In 312, the very next year, Constantine becomes senior emperor of the Western Roman Empire.
He is destined to take his place alongside Saints Paul and Peter and the martyrs in Christianity's Hall of Fame. But first, Constantine needs to remove his co-ruler from the frame to defeat his rival for power in the West, Maxentius, before he can take control. As a pagan, Maxentius summons up every god he can to unnerve his rival, while Constantine searches for a god to protect him. The church historians record how before launching into battle, something extraordinary happens. In a dream, Constantine sees a burning cross with the sun behind it, carrying a banner with the words, "By this sign, conquer." He is urged to adorn the heavenly sign on the shields of his soldiers, the Greek letter chi, which looks like RX, coupled with rho, which looks like RP, better known as the chi rho, the first letters of Christ's name in Greek.
Constantine, to champion Christianity, seems still to be an enormous risk in an overwhelmingly pagan world.
The church, I think, emerges stronger from the Great Persecution. The church now has a gallery of martyrs that it can parade. The church has demonstrated its strength, and Constantine, recognizing the extraordinary resilience of the church and therefore the potential power of a deal with the church.
Christian accounts written around the time tell how Constantine believes he is blessed by his sacred message from the Christian God. Under the Holy Banner, Constantine's army crushes Maxentius near the Milvian Bridge outside of Rome. This first victory of Christianity over paganism is one of the critical turning points in the relationship between Rome and the Church.
As you know, 10 years before that, Christians had been illegal, they had been persecuted. Suddenly, the emperor has joined their group. Astonishing.
Yet doubts have always persisted over Emperor Constantine's miraculous conversion.
Some people say Constantine's conversion was very convenient. It was very politically motivated. It was a way to control his empire. It was obviously a fraud, but it worked. And others have said it was a genuine conversion.
His parents are known to have believed in the idea of one supreme being, and there may be other political reasons why Constantine opts for Christianity. Even before his victory over Maxentius, he was in favor of tolerance, returning Christian property confiscated or destroyed during the Great Persecution, while setting free imprisoned bishops. After surviving Diocletian's Great Persecution, in the space of 2 years, the Western Empire has a Christian sympathizer in power who has defeated a pagan adversary in the process. So, whether or not Constantine's conversion is motivated by his alleged premonition or not, is, I suppose, a moot point. Especially as, however strong his faith, he is first and foremost a Roman emperor, and an extremely ambitious one at that.
Within 12 years of his victory at Milvian Bridge, Constantine has fought his way to become undisputed sole ruler of a completely reunified Roman Empire. His territories stretch in the west from the borders of Scotland to the east to the river Euphrates. He really is ruler of the classical world. This is the city that Constantine establishes as his new imperial capital, Constantinople, a city that will rival and surpass Rome.
Today, better known as Istanbul, it's a reminder of the amazing grandeur the Romans left for us. In this busy modern metropolis, there are clues to Constantine's plan.
Everywhere you look. This often forgotten, rather forlorn-looking column over here is actually one of the most important clues to Constantine's plan and agenda. It originally stood at the Sanctuary of Apollo in Delphi in central Greece, and put there in the 5th century BC, which makes it today 2,500 years old. Incredible. Now, why is this important for our story? Well, in stripping some of the most important pagan sanctuaries in the empire of their relics and moving them here, Constantine is claiming the authority of his classical pagan past. He's literally moving the Roman cultural phenomena in a new direction on a grand scale. And for the city of Constantinople, what that means is this: Constantine is not building a pagan or a Christian city. He's shaping it and equipping it to be both.
Meanwhile, in the Holy Land, Constantine's mother, Helena, is busy pinpointing places to memorialize Jesus himself. It's very much a family affair.
These steps lead down to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which stands on the site to which Helena believed Jesus carried his cross and was crucified.
Archaeologists and biblical scholars debate the location of some sites Helena claims to have connections with Jesus' life and death. But real or not, I can understand why putting down markers was so important. It provides early believers with a monumental history, a bedrock the church can build upon.
Places like this that Helena identified across Jerusalem and indeed across the Holy Land have become pilgrimage and tourist places ever since.
Okay, so with the emperor and his family on board, with churches and monasteries and a new capital city, the future of Christianity seems more assured. The church even has an established hierarchy, bishops, priests and deacons spread across large parts of the Roman Empire.
Christians are no longer an occasional inconvenience for the Roman power brokers, pawns in the game of imperial politics. Now they are players.
Everything seems to be falling into place. But appearances, I'm realizing, can be deceptive. In spite of imperial sponsorship, factions in the Christian community seem hell-bent on making life difficult for Constantine. It's not about Roman concerns like buildings and cities. I'm told it's a war of words, which will have far-reaching consequences.
And one of the most pressing problems is actually the nature of Jesus himself. We can think about it this way. If our Chi-Rho represents Jesus, there are people who believe that he is human, like the Ebionites. But there are also those who believe that he is entirely divine, like the Docetists. And here's where it gets really tricky, because there are also people who believe he is a little bit of both. And if he is both, then is he similar to the Father? Or is he of the same substance as the Father? The Athanasians, the Arians, it gets more and more complicated.
There is so much discord that the church is in danger of breaking apart and sending Constantine's holy Christian dream up in smoke. To bring the unity he so craves, the emperor decides to take matters into his own hands. In 325 AD, Constantine orders bishops from across the empire to attend a summit meeting in the city of Nicaea.
He writes them a letter and says, I can't believe you're arguing over trivia. You should be grateful to us. You should be grateful to God that you have the freedom you have.
At the council, Constantine sits before his bishops. He takes their appeals, and then, one by one, he burns them all. He then announces what the one and only doctrine will be. It's known as the Nicene Creed. Simply put, we believe in one Almighty God, the Father. Jesus is the Son of God. Being of one substance with the Father, we believe in the Holy Spirit.
The document that came out of that meeting, Constantine then treated as a kind of litmus test. Do you agree to this? Then you're Orthodox. You don't agree to this? You're a heretic. So that just became for him a simple way of identifying the right kind of Christians from those he said were the wrong kind of Christians.
From a Roman point of view, it's another major turning point in the rise of Christianity. Because Constantine now gives his favored bishops legal responsibilities and unties the imperial purse strings, handing them the financial muscle to rebuild churches derelict since the Great Persecution. Piece by piece, the church is being transformed into a powerhouse, and remarkably, its structure is being underpinned by a Roman emperor.
These bishops, as he saw it, now his allies in religion, and also, of course, which meant loyalty to him as the leader of the empire, Christian leader, would also be his representatives locally.
With his brand of Christian doctrine, Constantine is cleverly integrating the Christian administration into the bureaucracy of the empire. So now they are the emperor's functionaries, effectively under the control of the Roman state.
And at the same time, and this is informal, he's made it clear inside the Roman state, inside the court, inside the army, that if you are a Christian, you're more likely to get on, because that's what's being encouraged by those in authority.
These actions are, of course, part of a bigger picture of Constantine's continuing involvement throughout his reign in Christian belief and practice, as well as its relationship with the Roman state. From his early Edict of Toleration, which ended the persecution of all religions, to his returning of Christian property to its rightful owners and the banning of crucifixion and gladiatorial shows, to his putting in place of some of the basic principles that still define our lives today, setting the dates of Easter, making Sunday a public holiday. But does he succeed in legitimizing the church?
Well, kind of. Constantine has excommunicated bishops who disagree with his perception of Jesus, has a new capital city named after him, and has given Christians some of the top jobs in the government. And yes, he's made Christianity legal. But there's a big Roman caveat.
Constantine does not go so far as to champion Christianity to the exclusion of all other religions. The Roman world is still divided. Many Romans are reluctant to give up their long-held traditions. The pagan world is still alive and well.
The stats don't lie. Only an estimated 10% of the Roman world is Christian. That's around 5 million in a total population of about 50 million. Constantine simply cannot afford to alienate the majority of his people who still worship a pantheon of ancient gods. In the first decade of his reign, although pagan god images on coins disappeared quickly, the pagan sun god remained. And now he brings all his political skills into play. Constantine also retains pagan scholars in his government and never gives up his pagan religious title of Pontifex Maximus. But not outlawing pagans will in fact soon come back to haunt the very people he has been trying to integrate, the Christians. Trouble has never been very far away from the imperial household. And true to form, 20 years after Constantine's death, there awaits another emperor with a score to settle. And this time, it's personal.
Constantine's nephew, the future Emperor Julian, is raised in a Christian way, groomed to become emperor under the tutelage of Christian bishops. But his life is in no way a settled one. In the imperial family, murder, politics, and intrigue are commonplace. There are over 50 emperors between Augustus and Constantine, but only 16 die of natural causes. Over half are murdered.
No big surprise then. When Constantine's branch of the family massacres Julian's side while he is just a little boy, he only survived the slaughter because he was sick and expected to die anyway.
He was never going to follow a religion followed by the man who'd wiped out his entire family. He sees himself as the doctor that can cure the world of Christianity. Christianity is an illness to him.
So understandably, his hatred of Constantine's religion is already primed to explode. And the catalyst is a man from one of the largest cities in the Roman world, Ephesus.
It is at the age of 21, while studying here in Ephesus, that Julian comes under the influence of Maximus,
a renowned pagan scholar of the age, and now with an impressionable student.
Maximus was one of his teachers, and he became this Svengali figure to Julian, and he initiated him more and more into the pagan cults.
Under the guidance of Maximus, Julian is reported to take part in a secret and bizarre pagan induction ceremony.
It looks as though initiates went down into a pit, they were covered over by a wicker covering, and the ox was sacrificed above them. So the initiates underneath were drenched in ox blood. It was a very, very showy form of religion.
For 10 years after, Julian keeps his pagan sentiments under wraps.
until 361, when he becomes sole emperor.
Now Julian sets about sabotaging Constantine's pro-Christian initiatives to try and sever the link between church and state.
Because he was a smart man, because he knew what Christianity was, he didn't want to persecute Christians. If he persecuted Christians, he would create martyrs, and he didn't want that. The way to get rid of Christians was to marginalize them, and that's exactly what he went out to do.
He uses the law to purge Christians from positions of power, cuts their allowances, withdraws the rights of teachers to use Christian texts, and reclaims their monuments for paganism.
This is a real threat to the pro-Christian leadership under Constantine, not just a chink in the armor of the new unified Roman state, but an entire U-turn is now on the cards.
Throughout Roman history, winning wars has been the benchmark of an emperor's supremacy. Julian is in fact an experienced general with a strong track record. So there's no better way for him to prove the power of the pagan gods than by a glorious victory over the neighboring enemies, the Persians, especially as his Christian predecessor had failed to do it. But Julian, not unusually for a Roman emperor, is killed on campaign soon after he takes power. It seems the pagan gods have deserted him. To some religious experts, Julian is a noble but tragic figure, desperately trying to restore Rome's traditional way of life, but powerless to do anything but temporarily stall the union between church and state.
There is no way that Julian, in 3 years, could possibly overturn it. It's notable that when Constantine died, he was buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles, surrounded by 12 statues of the 12 apostles, and his tomb was in the middle. The implication was very much he was the 13th apostle. That kind of propaganda Julian couldn't possibly compete with.
What Julian's story reveals is the strength of relationship that Constantine has forged between Christianity and the Roman Empire. There is a legend that during the persecutions around 250 AD, 7 young Christians are chased by hostile pagan Romans. They hide in this cave in Ephesus, here in Turkey, and fall asleep. The pagans close up the cave and leave them to die.
Nearly 200 years later,
When the cave is opened, the 7 young Christians miraculously awake, alive and well.
but everything has changed.
Christianity is the state-imposed religion of the Roman Empire. Now it is pagans who are being persecuted. Their story may be fiction,
But the chance that there would be a power shift away from the church dies with Julian. In 379 AD, Christian Emperor Theodosius takes command of the empire. During his reign, priests and monks grow more and more fanatical. And just as in the mythical story of the boys locked in the cave, pagans are now the ones being persecuted. It's a remarkable about-turn in their respective fortunes. And Christians are also now clashing with other Christians, still bitterly arguing over the relationship between Jesus and God. It leads Theodosius, as did Constantine, to read them the Riot Act.
Theodosius, like so many Roman emperors before him, seeks a unifying religious force, except that this time it is Christianity, not paganism.
But he goes one step further.
Not just any form of Christianity. He insists on the Nicene Creed adapted from Constantine's council some 60 years earlier. No other church is now legal. His edicts say that any deviation is demented and insane. He gets rid of the bishops who don't agree with his position and grants his supporters, like Bishop Ambrose of Milan, in whose basilica I am now, far-reaching powers in both church and local government. The effects of these changes are felt throughout the Roman world, especially in its capital cities, which, in the Western Roman Empire during the 4th century AD, is not Rome, but here, in Milan.
Theodosius now faces, as a Christian emperor, a new problem: how to marry the actions required of an autocratic ruler of an empire with Christian teachings and beliefs.
And it's no surprise that very soon he falls foul of exactly that problem.
In Thessalonica, Greece, Theodosius sends in troops to quell a public riot, but they go too far. Some 7,000 Roman citizens are slain by their own army. Publicly shamed for his savage act, Theodosius is confronted by his trusted ally, Bishop Ambrose of Milan.
Ambrose spoke the language of government. He spoke the language of ambassadors. He'd been to Oxbridge or the Ivy League equivalent. And when you have men like that in the church, the relationship with the church changes.
Now, these two immensely powerful men clash head-on. It appears to be the ultimate standoff: the Christian church versus the Roman state.
This is the crypt underneath the Basilica of St. Ambrose, where his body now resides.
Ambrose uses the massacre at Thessalonica to his own advantage. Christian texts record what happens next, like this. The bishop agrees to absolve Theodosius of his sins, but only if the emperor shows penitence in his presence. By deferring to Ambrose in return for a pardon, Theodosius is helping the church tighten its grip over the state. The deal is done. The Christianization of Rome appears complete.
But although this may look as if the bishops are now exerting influence over the emperor, this is, after all, the Roman Empire, which has, for its own ends, successfully engulfed peoples and cultures of nations all around the Mediterranean and Middle East for centuries. A victory for the church, an outright victory at least, is unlikely. And in fact, what happened is in many ways more interesting.
As with many stories from antiquity, in early Christianity there is often another, different version of the same event.
Theodosius realized he's overreacted and he needs to do something to say sorry. So he engineers with Ambrose a way of saying sorry to the entire empire. He gets Ambrose to refuse him communion.
Theodosius pays his penance, and by accepting his remorse and absolving him of his sins, Bishop Ambrose and the Church are effectively supporting the emperor. For better and worse, from now on, the Church becomes an instrument in the state apparatus.
And in sanctioning Theodosius's plea bargain, Ambrose has revealed to the emperor just how far he will go to earn a share of power. By performing this act of deception, far from Rome being Christianized, the Church has played straight into the hands of the state.
What's undoubtedly happened, though, is that the Church has changed very much in character. It's become more Roman, it's become institutionalized, it's become part of the establishment, and in a sense, they're selling out.
Being second among equals will soon prove a beneficial arrangement for the Church.
In 391 AD, Theodosius outlaws pagan worship, at a stroke sweeping away practices that date back to the very foundation of Rome some 1,200 years before.
It's a pivotal moment in Roman history, in fact, in the whole of classical civilization. With this proclamation, the Christian God replaces the profusion of Roman deities, consigning pagan devotion to the past. Their temples are shut down, converted into churches, or actively destroyed. The Olympic Games disbanded, sacrificing forbidden, all symbols of paganism banned, oracles fall silent, and even the reading of pagan texts outlawed. The last traces of Rome's ancient traditions are now carefully restyled to ensure a seamless fit between church and state, and in turn avoid alienating those citizens born and bred pagan.
You get, for example, the birth of Jesus at the time of a great Roman festival, now celebrated as Christmas. The Virgin Mary emerges in Ephesus, which is devoted to the goddess Artemis. People traditionally said she went there after the death of Jesus, lived there, she's said to have died there, and the cult of the Virgin Mary emerges in place of the goddess Artemis.
The empire, in alliance with its Christian bishops, has adapted and reinvented ancient folklore, and the pagan origins of these ceremonies, rituals, and gods eventually lost in the mists of time.
In their place, religious practice is restricted to one God and one faith only, that of Jesus Christ.
It's an incredible story.
How does an obscure Jewish cult manage to survive under Roman rule, beliefs, politics, and customs, and then emerge as the official and only religion of the entire Roman world?
And yet, just 80 years before the outlawing of paganism, Christianity was suffering persistent persecution under the Romans. 200 years before that, Jesus probably had only about 10,000 followers worldwide. And 100 years before that, Christianity did not even exist.
It could easily have been one of many cults in the Roman Empire. Without imperial patronage, I don't see that it could have become the worldwide power that it has become.
Rome had absorbed Christianity to such an extent that they had become the same thing.
By the end of the 4th century, Jesus becomes represented like this, a Roman emperor. Christian imagery and doctrine irreversibly interwoven with that of Roman kingship.
Certainly, if you look at many of the images of the time, it's very hard to know which one you're looking at. Am I looking at an emperor or am I looking at Jesus? They were one and the same.
Christianity has taken on the persona of its host, the authoritarian Roman state. Religion and politics united. Jesus has indeed risen to power. But that is by no means the end of the story.
For the Christian Church as an institution,
For Christianity as a belief, And for the Christians as people, this was only the start
Of a path of continuous development
discovery and conflict, which lasts
to this day.